What I would like from you guys is to put yourself in the position of a director, and what are the critical questions that a board member should be asking their head of IT or head of security to make sure that they are understanding the threat to their companies.
Right. Well, one of the things I think that they should want to know is, how are we vulnerable? Where are our vulnerabilities, and then what are we doing about that? One needs to understand you're never going to close out the threat. The threat's always going to be present. The question is, what are we doing to tamp that down? What are we doing to address that? What are we doing both on the technology side, but what are we doing on the people side? So when I think about the insider threat, I think of anybody who has access to our information. So that includes call centers that are now internationally based. So what are we doing in that space? What are we doing in terms of messaging? Because that's very important. You can look at technology and look for a silver bullet, but the fact of the matter is people play a very, very important role in our whole cyber defense. So what are we doing in that space with as much as 15% turnover in some of those call centers and in some of our data centers? What are we doing to make sure that that messaging is constant? So what are we doing to both strengthen our defenses from a technological standpoint, but also what are we doing with the human equation? That's what I would want to know.
I think there's three areas that I would highlight from a board's perspective. One is trying to have an understanding, asking the questions to have an understanding of what is our threat, our risk assessment process all about. How do we do that as an enterprise? And then what are we doing to mitigate that threat? So have a good understanding of that process as an enterprise. Secondly, I would want to ensure that we are benchmarking with other companies. What are other companies doing? What are some of the new ideas in the industry? And then are we sharing best practices with those other companies? And then thirdly, are we messaging this to the employees? Do the employees, does the corporation in toto understand what the cyber area is all about today? Because cyber doesn't just involve data, it involves people.
You know, what I would say to a board member is to think about cybersecurity risk the way you think about all other risks in the corporation. You want to understand what it is and determine whether you're going to accept it, manage it internally, or possibly outsource it. So how do you get to that point if you're a board member? If you're a board member, you want to get an overall governance perspective on how is your cybersecurity team being managed. And there's a couple of key things I think you can do. One, I'd be asking your Chief Security Officer, what is our cybersecurity strategy? And I'd also dig a little deeper and be asking, okay, so what are the key objectives around this strategy? And how are we going to measure them in a way to show we're progressing on this roadmap to be safer? There's a number of ways you can do that, but they should be able to tell you such things as, well, I'm working under a particular framework. So for example, if I'm a regulated entity, what is that framework? Or is it the new NIST cybersecurity framework? How have you identified your assets? What is the risk to those assets? There's 4 or 5 bad actors you want to be looking at: nation state, criminal enterprise, hacktivist, terrorist, and then, as Mike and Jeff mentioned, the insider. I think if you get a holistic view of your cybersecurity program within a framework structure, like you do everything else if you're a board member, you'll get a better understanding where you sit by way of your risk posture.